What would you do if you were the invisible waitress refilling water glasses at the most dangerous table in the city, and you overheard, in a language nobody thought you understood, that the beautiful woman on the boss's arm had already sold him out, that the men were in position, and that the only thing standing between him and a bullet was whether you had the nerve to slip him a note before the check arrived? She had 30 seconds, maybe less. She could set down the water, keep her eyes on the floor, and walk away the way she had walked, away from everything her whole life, and no one would ever know she had heard a thing. Or she could fold a napkin, write 4 words, and place it beside his hand, and gamble her life on a stranger everyone was afraid of. This is a story of hidden worth, split-second courage, and the ruthless man who looked up from a note in a waitress's handwriting and finally saw the one person in the room who had chosen to save him. Marisol Vega had been invisible for so long that she had come to think of it as a skill rather than a wound. She was 28, soft and generously curved, with a round, kind face and a quiet way of moving, and she worked the late shift at a restaurant on the wealthy side of the harbor where the tablecloths were heavy, and the clientele was the kind you did not look at directly. She was good at her job in the way that invisible people are good at their jobs, which is completely. She remembered every order without writing it down. She refilled a glass before anyone noticed it was low. And she had learned, over years of carrying trays through rooms full of powerful people, that the surest way to survive proximity to dangerous men was to become a piece of the furniture, to move through their world without ever once being seen. What none of them knew was that Marisol Vega spoke 5 languages. She had grown up in a household where 3 of them collided at the dinner table, and had added 2 more the way other people collect stamps, quietly, for the pleasure of it, and she had discovered early that a waitress presumed to understand. Nothing is trusted with everything. Powerful men, who guarded their words in English, spoke freely in the languages they assumed no one around them could follow. And Marisol, refilling their water, clearing their plates, had spent years hearing things she was never meant to hear, and saying nothing at all, because saying something was how invisible people stopped being safe. And on the night everything changed, she was working a private back room where the most dangerous man on the coast was having dinner with a woman he clearly adored, and she heard in rapid low Russian from the 2 men at the corner table the thing that would force her to choose. The man at the center of that room was Nikolai Sabatini, and the restaurant had been quietly emptied of its usual crowd for him, which told Marisol everything about who he was before anyone said his name. He was tall and broad, and dressed in a charcoal suit cut with lethal precision, the head of a syndicate that owned the ports and the fear of every powerful family, for 100 miles, rumored to end a life with a single unhurried nod. He rarely raised his voice, and tonight he was not being a boss. Tonight he was leaning toward a stunning woman in red named Larisa, laughing at something she had said, his guard down in a way Marisol suspected very few people had ever seen, because a man like that does not relax, unless he believes he is safe. He believed he was safe. He was wrong. At the corner table 2 men Marisol had served without a second glance were murmuring to each other in Russian, and they were not discussing the wine. She caught it in fragments as she moved between tables, the way you catch a melody through a wall, and each fragment was worse than the last. The woman confirmed it. He is not carrying tonight. She made sure of that. And then the words that stopped the blood in her veins. We are in position. Wait for her to leave the table. She will find a reason. When she stands, we move. Marisol kept walking. She kept her face perfectly still, kept her hands steady on the water pitcher, because a lifetime of being invisible had taught her that the most dangerous thing she could do was change her expression, but her mind was moving very fast. The beautiful woman in red had sold him. The men were already here, and the only person in the entire room who knew it was the waitress that nobody had looked at once all evening. Marisol Vega had 30 seconds to decide whether she was the kind of person who walked away. She had walked away her whole life. She stood at the service station with her heart slamming, folding and unfolding a napkin. Every instinct she owned, every year of training herself to be furniture, screamed at her to set down the pitcher and go home and know nothing. This was not her fight. Getting involved with men like this was how invisible people ended up in the harbor. And a small, stubborn voice, underneath all of it, asked whether she could live with herself if she said nothing. And a man died 3 feet away because she had been too afraid to be seen for 10 seconds. She could not. That was the whole of it. She simply could not. So, Marisol took the little pen from her apron, and on the inside of a folded napkin, in small, neat letters, she wrote 4 words. "Your girlfriend sold you." Then she added, because precision was the only weapon she had, a second line. "They're in position. Corner table. 2 men waiting for her to stand." She set a fresh glass of water down at Nikolai Sabatini's right hand, and beside it, without a flicker, without a change in her breathing, she placed the folded napkin, and she murmured, in the flat, pleasant voice of a waitress reciting specials, "Please don't look up," and she walked away. To Nikolai Sabatini did not look up. That was the first thing that told Marisol he was even more dangerous than his reputation, because a lesser man would have flinched, would have glanced at the napkin, would have telegraphed everything. He did none of it. He let his hand drift to the napkin as though reaching for his glass, and he unfolded it against the tablecloth below the sight line of the room, and for 1/4 of 1 second his eyes moved down and read 4 words in a stranger's handwriting. And then he laughed at something the woman in red had said, and reached across the table to take her hand. Warm and easy, and Marisol, watching from the service station with her pulse in her throat, understood that she had just handed a loaded truth to a man who knew exactly what to do with it. What happened next happened so smoothly that most of the room never knew anything had occurred at all. Nikolai murmured something to Larissa, an apology, a call he had to take, and he rose, unhurried, still holding her hand, and drew her up with him as though to walk her out, which meant the 2 men in the corner now had no clean angle, because their target and their inside woman were suddenly one moving shape. He signaled, so subtly Marisol only caught it because she was looking for it, and men she had not realized were his, began to drift from the edges of the room. And then it was very fast and very quiet. The 2 men at the corner table were on their feet, with their hands moving toward their jackets, and Nikolai's people were already there, and the woman in red opened her mouth to scream a warning that came half a second too late, and it was over almost before it began. A brief, brutal scuffle in a back room that the diners in the front would later describe as a dropped tray. Marisol had pressed herself into the service alcove, shaking, and when the room settled, she looked up and found Nikolai Sabatini looking directly at her across the wreckage, the woman in red held fast between 2 of his men, and his dark eyes fixed on the waitress who had chosen to save his life. "Come here," he said quietly. And Marisol, who had spent her whole life not being seen, walked out of the alcove into the most dangerous man on the coast's full attention. He took her, over her frightened silence, to a quiet office above the restaurant, and there, with his men handling the corner table and the woman in red somewhere. Marisol did not ask about. He looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "You speak Russian," he said. 5 languages, Marisol said, before she could stop herself, and then flushed, because a lifetime of hiding it did not undo in one night. He studied her. "My own men at that table did not catch it," he said. "They speak Russian. They were listening for a threat, and they heard two businessmen discussing wine, because that is what those two were trained to sound like. And a waitress, refilling my water, heard a murder being planned, and had the nerve to tell me. He was quiet a moment. "Do you understand that you saved my life tonight, and that you had every reason in the world to walk away, and that most people would have?" "I couldn't," Marisol said simply. He tilted his head. "Why?" And Marisol, exhausted and frightened, and stripped of the invisibility she had hidden behind for a decade, told him the truth. "Because I would have known," she said. "For the rest of my life, I would have known that I stood there and let it happen. I have spent my whole life being invisible, Mr. Sabatini. I did not want the last useful thing about being invisible to be that I got to watch a man die and pretend I hadn't seen." Nikolai Sabatini was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "What is your name?" And when she told him, he said it back to her. Once, the way a man commits something to memory. Larissa, it turned out, had been the cornerstone of a plan 2 years in the building, and the person who had built it was closer to Nikolai than the woman in red had ever been. But that unraveling came later. What came first in the days after that night was that Nikolai Sabatini did the thing that stunned everyone around him. He did not pay Marisol off and send her back to her shifts. He offered her a job, and when she asked warily what job, he told her the truth, that he had spent 15 years surrounded by men paid to listen who had missed a plot unfolding at his own dinner table, and that a woman who could sit unnoticed in any room and understand everything said in it was worth more than any of them. He wanted her to be his ears. Marisol, who had spent a decade being furniture, was offered a position whose entire value was that she noticed. She took it. And her world changed. He brought her into rooms, quiet in the corner, and afterward she told him what the men who thought no one understood them had actually said. And time after time, she was right. And time after time it mattered. She caught a partner planning to renege in Portuguese. She caught a threat folded into a Cantonese pleasantry a full day before it moved. And Nikolai, who trusted no one, found himself trusting the quiet woman who had once been too invisible to see, and slowly the walls he lived behind began to come down. They fell into a rhythm of late nights over a decanter of amber whiskey he poured for himself and a cup of coffee he poured for her. And he told her about the father he had buried and the trust he had learned to bury with him, things he had said to no one. He learned she flinched at raised voices and softened at kindness, and it made him want to burn down everyone who had ever made her feel like furniture. And one night at her door, his hand rose to cradle her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheek, and Marisol thought he might cross the distance, and instead he only looked at her, memorizing her, and murmured good night, and left her aching for a man the whole world feared. But Marisol, being Marisol, had never stopped listening. And what she had begun to hear in the seams of that house did not fit. The cruelty came at a formal gathering, and it came wearing couture. Nikolai had brought Marisol on his arm in a gown of deep wine that celebrated every curve she had spent her life apologizing for, and midway through the evening, a sleek, beautiful woman named Camilla, who had spent 2 years positioning herself to be the next Mrs. Sabatini, cornered her by the bar with an audience in tow. "Oh, the waitress," Camilla said brightly, loud enough for the room, letting her eyes travel over Marisol's body with theatrical sympathy. "Everyone's talking about it." The girl who passed him a napkin. She smiled like a blade. "It's very sweet, but you do understand. You got lucky once, sweetheart. He's grateful, that's all. Nobody looks at a girl who carries other people's plates and sees a queen. Enjoy the dress. It won't last." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees, and the old Marisol would have folded, apologized, and slipped away to compose herself. But something had been rebuilt in her, and she did not shrink. "You're right that I carried plates," she said, her quiet voice carrying with perfect calm, "for years. Which taught me to listen instead of talk, and I've been listening tonight. Camilla, and the gentleman you arrived with, has told 3 different people, 3 different stories, about where he was on Thursday, in 3 different languages, apparently assuming you don't speak any of them." She tilted her head. "You should ask him which one is true." Nobody looks at the waitress. It's the best seat in the house. The silence had teeth. Camilla went the color of ash and left the room. And Nikolai, who had crossed the floor in silence, took Marisol's hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in front of the entire gathering. "You never make yourself small in this house again, Mia," he murmured, using the endearment for the first time. "Not in my world, and never in front of me." But across the room a man who had smiled at Nikolai Sabatini for 18 years had gone very still because he had built the plan that Larissa carried out, and he had assumed it died with her, and now he understood that the waitress who heard everything was still in the house, still listening, still pulling threads. The man was Gennaro, Nikolai's consigliere, and he had made one fatal assumption, which was that Larissa was the whole plan and not merely its blade. For 2 years, Gennaro had been arranging to hand the family to a rival syndicate, and Larissa had been his instrument, placed at Nikolai's side to open the door when the moment came. When the napkin cost him Larissa and the 2 men in the corner, Gennaro did the patient thing. He grieved with Nikolai over the betrayal. He helped hunt the rival cell. And he waited, certain the danger had passed, until he realized the waitress, who had heard the Russian at the corner table, could just as easily hear the seams of everything he had ever said in front of her. Gennaro smiled, thin and cold, and began, very quietly, to plan. It was the last mistake he would ever make as a free man. Marisol found the shape of it the way she found everything, which was by listening to what people said when they thought the furniture could not understand. Over the weeks she had catalogued, without meaning to, 100 small conversations, and now she laid them beside one another. Gennaro on the phone in Italian, a language he did not know she spoke, telling someone that the timeline had only been delayed. Gennaro reassuring a supplier in the same language that the arrangement still stood. And the worst of it, the thing that turned her cold, was a single sentence she had overheard weeks ago, and not understood the weight of at the time. That Larissa had never been meant to survive the night, that the men in the corner had been instructed to remove her along with Nikolai, so that no one who knew the true architect would be left to name him. Larissa had been a loose end her own handler had planned to cut, which meant the handler was still in the house. Marisol brought it to Nikolai that night and laid it out without drama, in order, every overheard fragment, every language, every date. And Nikolai went very still, and then he did the thing that undid her completely. He believed her instantly. He did not ask her twice. He did not demand proof from a man with a title. He looked at a case, assembled entirely from things said in front of a woman everyone had assumed, could not understand them, and said, quietly, "Gennaro." "Yes," said Marisol. Then he took her face in his hands and said, "If I move on him, and he sees it coming, he will not come at me. He will come at you, because you are the one thing in this house that can hear him." And neither of them knew that Gennaro had already made that decision. The fortress went dark at 2:30. Marisol woke to a silence, so complete it pressed against her skin, and every instinct a decade of listening had honed, screamed. that something was catastrophically wrong. The power was out. The generators stayed dead. Nikolai had been drawn out at midnight to a meeting she now understood was a fabrication. And Marisol, sitting up in the dark, knew with terrible certainty that they had come while he was away, and that they had come for her. She did not scream, she did not faint, she did not run blindly. She thought, cold and clear, the way she always had. 2 floors below, a silenced weapon coughed, and a body met the marble. And Marisol Vega did the thing that no one in that house had ever thought to account for, because the thing she was best at in all the world was hearing. She could not see the men moving through the dark, but she could hear them, and they did not know it. She heard 4 sets of footsteps, and the small wet sound of night goggles being adjusted, and a whispered instruction in Russian, "Take the woman alive. Gennaro wants to know what she gave to the police," and she understood at once that they thought she had already talked, which meant they needed her, which meant she had a little time. She moved through the dark house without a light, because she had spent weeks learning it by ear, and she led them, deliberately, by the small sounds she allowed them to hear, away from the wing where she actually meant to go. She got to the study, where the safe held a hard-wired line on its own circuit, and got one message out. And then she did the thing that turned the dark into her ally instead of theirs. She went to the old service corridor she had found in her first week, the long, narrow stone passage, with the vaulted ceiling that turned every whisper into a chorus, and made it impossible to tell where a sound came from, and she waited there in the black. And when the first man entered it, hunting her, she spoke softly, from a direction that did not exist, and watched him swing his weapon at a wall. She moved and spoke again, and the corridor threw her voice, a third way, and the men who could not see and could not place her began, in the dark, to lose their nerve. And then she heard the unhurried footsteps of Gennaro himself, who did not startle, who understood exactly what she was doing. "Marisol," he said pleasantly into the echoing dark, "clever girl, you turned my own corridor into a trick." He was moving carefully now, listening as hard as she was. "Do you know, in 18 years, no one ever once worried about the help. We spoke freely, in front of 100 waiters and drivers and maids, because they were furniture. And then a piece of the furniture turned out to speak 5 languages. He paused. "It is almost admirable. But you have made one mistake tonight. You are alone, and I am not." And Marisol Vega, pressed into the dark stone with her heart slamming, did the one thing he never expected. She spoke, and this time she did not throw her voice. She let him hear exactly where she was. "You've made the mistake, Gennaro," she said. Silence. "You think I only listen," she said. "But I have spent 10 years remembering everything, and 6 days ago I wrote all of it down. Every call in Italian, every date, the instruction to kill Larissa so she couldn't name you. And I gave it to 3 people, who will hand it to Nikolai and the whole commission the moment I stop confirming I am alive." She let it settle in the echoing dark. "You needed me alive to find out what I gave the police. But I never gave anything to the police. I gave it to him. Which means you came into this house for nothing, and you have spent your one advantage. Surprise. Chasing a voice in a hallway." Gennaro said nothing, which was the closest thing to a concession she would ever get. And in that silence, the front gates below exploded inward with the tortured shriek of an engine pushed past its limits. Nikolai had come home. Time seemed to fracture. Gunfire erupted below, brief and brutal and absolute. Gennaro turned toward it, and in the echoing dark of the corridor he could not tell how close it was, and Marisol, who had counted every stone of that passage, came out of the black at the exact place where the ceiling dropped and drove her shoulder into him. He went down hard against the low arch, his weapon skittering away across the stone, and she kicked it into the dark, and kept moving, because she knew by heart how many paces stood between her and the door. And then the corridor mouth flooded with light, and Nikolai filled it, soaked in rain, his eyes wild and searching. Dario, his loyal lieutenant, poured in behind him with 4 armed men. And the trap Gennaro had spent 2 years building snapped shut around him instead. Nikolai had him by the throat against the wall before he could speak. 18 years, he said. You planned my death at my own table, and when the waitress cost you your blade, you came into my house for her. Then he turned his head, and the murderous cold in his eyes dissolved into raw, naked fear, and he released Gennaro to Dario's men and crossed to Marisol in 2 strides. His hands moved frantically over her arms, her face, her shoulders, checking for blood, for wounds, for any harm to what was his. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Did they touch you? Look at me. Breathe." "I'm all right," Marisol wept, her fingers twisting in his soaked coat. "I hid in the loud corridor and let them chase an echo." Nikolai let out a broken, disbelieving laugh into her hair, and then he framed her tear-streaked face in his trembling hands and looked at her, the way no one in her whole overlooked life had ever looked at her. "You are magnificent," he breathed. "My own men missed the plot at my table, and you heard it refilling a water glass, and then you fought off a team in the dark with nothing but your own voice. And then his voice cracked open entirely. Do you remember what you told me? The first night, he said hoarsely, that you couldn't walk away because you would have known." He pressed his forehead to hers. "I have spent every day since terrified of the same thing. That I would let you keep being invisible and spend the rest of my life knowing I had." Gennaro, the man who had smiled at Nikolai Sabatini for 18 years while planning his murder, learned the price of underestimating her before the week was out. Nikolai did not act in blind rage. He let Marisol lay the whole of it before the commission, every intercepted call, every language, every date, the order to kill Larissa so she could never name the architect, all of it heard and remembered by a woman that world had spent a decade treating as furniture. And when the 5 families had heard it, Marisol did not counsel death. "You do not need to make him a martyr," she said quietly. "You need to make him nothing." So they did it her way. They stripped Gennaro of every asset and exposed 2 years of treason to the very families he had schemed to serve, and cast him out, alive, bankrupt, disgraced, a man whose own name became a warning whispered on every dock, a fate the old men agreed was far crueler than any quick and merciful bullet. And Camilla, who had said that nobody looks at a girl who carries other people's plates and sees a queen, found that the man she had arrived with was in fact connected to the very investigation Marisol's evidence had opened, and spent a long, humiliating season being asked about it. And afterward, watched from the far end, of every table Marisol now sat at the head. Months later, on a bright morning washed gold with new sun, Marisol Vega stood on the terrace of the fortress. She now moved through as its quiet center, and she was not furniture anymore. She wore rich colors tailored to celebrate every curve she had spent 28 years apologizing for. She had stopped making herself small in rooms. Nikolai came out and stopped, simply to watch her the way he had watched her cross an alcove into his life. "You're listening again," he said. "I always am," she said, and smiled. "It's the best seat in the house." He crossed to her and took her hands. "Do you know what I understood? The night you set that napkin down," he said quietly. A room full of people looked at you all evening and saw someone carrying water. He tilted her chin up, his dark eyes soft, in a way the rest of the world would never see, and you were the only one in it who saw all of us. Everyone in my life is paid to protect me, Mia. And the one person who actually did was a stranger who had every reason to walk away and chose, in 30 seconds, to save my life instead. He kissed her knuckles. You were never invisible. You were simply the only person in the room paying attention, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain you are never overlooked again. Marisol looked up at the man the whole city feared, a man who bowed to no one, and yet bowed entirely to her. And for the first time in her life, she believed she was exactly enough. She had spent a decade making herself into furniture, certain that the safest thing a woman like her could be was unseen, and she had proven every last one of them wrong, because the gift the whole world had overlooked, the quiet ability to sit in any room and truly hear it, had saved a life the night she found the nerve to be seen for 10 seconds. She had slipped a note to the most dangerous man on the coast, 4 words, in a waitress's handwriting. And in choosing, for once, not to walk away, she had walked straight out of a life of invisibility and into the one place on earth where being unseen was finally gloriously over. If Marisol and Nikolai's story of split-second courage, hidden worth, and hard-won vindication moved you, if your heart stopped when the waitress set that napkin down and whispered, "Please don't look up," then do us a small favor before you go. Smash that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that the person nobody notices is so often the one who sees everything. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another twist-filled tale of the overlooked soul who finally gets everything she deserves. And drop a comment below and tell us what was your favorite moment in Marisol and Nikolai's story.